know you're still awake, carrying the heavy thoughts the day left behind. Breathe easy. You don't have to carry them alone anymore. Whenever I am driving alone in the dead of night, looking past the dash cam, at the endless highway, I can feel a cold, heavy weight around me, right here inside the cabin. I just passed a mangled, cracked guardrail on the shoulder. The metal twisted from an accident years ago, and I could swear a soul was standing right beside it, watching my headlights. The spirits of these forgotten roads crowd around my car, trying to tell me something, giving me goosebumps. But you are safe here in the passenger seat. In a few seconds, you will hear the heavy rain sound, as I am hearing while driving, but no worries. When the story starts, it will all calm down naturally and make the atmosphere soothing so you can relax for the rest of the night. The modern world runs on a rapid-fire rhythm of notifications and stress, keeping our nervous systems hyper-alert. But when time stresses, stories heal. I'm Deb, and this is True Horror Stories Film. Before we dive deeper into the dark, take a moment to subscribe and hit that like button. It helps keep our midnight sanctuary alive. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from tonight. I have gathered these roadside secrets, and now I will share all these with you. Let us begin. There is a face I cannot stop thinking about. Not a whole face. That is the part I cannot explain to anyone who was not there. Just the edges of one, the suggestion of features arranged in a way that was almost right, almost human, almost something I could have looked at without my stomach turning cold and my hands going numb at my sides. I have spent a long time trying to decide what was worse, that it was so close to a real face or that it was not close enough. I took the job because I needed the distance. That is the honest version. The version I told my department chair was about primary source documentation and the preservation of early 20th century military medical records. And that was also true, but it was true the way a coat is true. It covered something that was not decent to show in polite company. My mother had died in April. My marriage had ended in February, which is the kind of sequence that does not leave a person standing entirely straight. When the contract came through for the Bellard Archive in St. Mary Parish, I did not hesitate long enough to be called deliberate. I said yes before the sentence was finished, packed 2 bags, and drove 11 hours south to a part of Louisiana that did not feel entirely connected to anywhere else on the map. The facility was not impressive. It had been a satellite processing wing for a now decommissioned veterans hospital, mothballed in the 1970s, and transferred to the university's historical preservation program sometime in the 90s, during an administrative reshuffling that nobody could quite fully explain. The building was low and flat, and the color of old mustard, set back from a 2-lane state highway behind a stand of cypress trees so old and wide that the building appeared, from the road, to simply not exist. There was a gravel lot. There was a rusted gate that the site manager, a quiet man named Durrell, had to shoulder open each morning with both hands. There was, inside, the smell of time compressed into something almost physical. Formaldehyde from sealed medical containers somewhere in the deeper storage. Mold from a corner of the east wing that had been damp for longer than anyone would officially admit, and something else underneath all of it that I could not name for the first 3 days, and then decided I would not try to name after that. Darrell had been maintaining the building for 11 years. He was not a talkative man, and I respected that immediately. He came in at 7, checked the humidity monitors, signed a log, and left most mornings by 9. He was there if the generator had a problem, or if a shelf in the north stack needed resecuring. He was not there for conversation, and he did not offer any. The one thing he said to me on my first morning, while showing me the climate-controlled room where the primary records were stored, stayed with me long enough that I should have paid it more attention. He said, pulling open the heavy door to the inner archive, that the collection had been put together by a military physician named Dr. Harold Vance, who had spent years assembling documentation on reconstructive surgical procedures performed on American and Allied soldiers during and after the First World War. He said the collection was extensive and largely uncatalogued. He said that somebody at the university had decided, about 4 years prior, to start the cataloging work, and then stopped for reasons that Darrell did not know and apparently did not ask about. He said, turning to leave, that the deepest section of the collection, a locked metal cabinet in the far corner of the archive room, had a file that prior researchers had flagged as requiring special handling. He did not say what that meant. I did not ask. He left, and the door to the outer corridor swung shut behind him, and I was alone in a room full of the careful, organized, forgotten work of a doctor who had spent his life documenting the things that happened to faces in war. I told myself I was settled. I almost believed it. The work was slow, and the silence was total, and I found in the first week that I was grateful for both. The records were extraordinary. Vance had been methodical to the point of obsession, detailed intake photographs, surgical diagrams rendered in a clean and economical hand, post-operative notes with a specificity that told you this was a man who believed in the moral weight of precision. These were soldiers who had lost pieces of themselves to artillery and shrapnel and wire. These were men who had arrived at a surgical facility looking, as one intake note described it, like the landscape they had been fighting in. Broken in the middle, unrecognizable, still somehow alive. Vance had documented each one. He had noted not only the surgical procedure, but the patient's disposition, their ability to communicate, the progress of their recovery, and the small milestones that a different doctor might not have bothered to record. Whether a man could drink from a cup by himself again. Whether his mother, when she visited, was able to look at him without looking away. I cataloged 112 folders in the first 10 days. I photographed records. I cross-referenced intake dates with existing hospital documentation. I worked for 9 and 10 hours at a stretch without needing to eat, which I recognized, somewhere quiet in the back of my mind, was less about professional dedication and more about the fact that when I was working, I was not thinking about April, and I was not thinking about February, and the part of my brain that had been running a constant low-grade emergency since my mother stopped breathing was, Finally, quiet. The building settled around me each day in the late afternoon. There was rain most evenings. From inside the archive room, the rain had a strange quality, a soft, irregular percussion against the flat roof that arrived and departed in waves. And sometimes, in the moments between cataloging, I would sit and listen to it and feel almost still. The detail I noticed on the 8th day I had not thought about. There were 9 folders in the collection marked with a small red paper tag on the upper right corner of their covers. The tag was no larger than a thumbnail, the color of a wound that had just begun to dry. I cataloged the folders as I encountered them. The 9th red-tagged folder was in the section I reached on the 8th day, and when I pulled it from the shelf, something fell from between the cover and the first page and landed face down on the archive table. It was a photograph. I turned it over. It was an image of a man, or what had been a man, seated in a hospital chair, taken from a slight distance. What should have been his face was not precisely there. The damage was extensive. The image was technically clinical, the way all of Vance's documentation was clinical, but the effect was not clinical at all. I sat with it for a moment, then placed it carefully back inside the folder, tagged the folder in the cataloging system, and moved on. I noted in my log that the folder contained photographic material of a sensitive nature. I did not note that I had spent nearly 4 minutes looking at the photograph before I was able to put it down. I did not note that when I finally did put it down, my hands were not quite steady. I told myself it was just the subject matter. A reasonable response to an unreasonable image. I went back to the rest of the work. The locked cabinet was where the day changed its shape on me. It was the 22nd day of the contract. Daryl had left earlier than usual. Something about a family matter in Opelousas, something he mentioned without meeting my eyes on his way out. The facility was mine alone by 8:30 in the morning, and the sky outside the high, narrow windows of the archive room was the color of old pewter and moving fast, the way Louisiana sky moves when the weather is deciding something. I had reached the end of the catalog material 2 days prior, and spent the intervening time working through peripheral documentation, correspondence files, supply ledgers, and several boxes of administrative material that yielded nothing of immediate research value but needed to be assessed and noted. The locked cabinet had been there the whole time. It was a standard military-issue storage unit, olive green, with a combination padlock that Darrell had told me, at the beginning of the contract, was covered by a secondary authorization code that the university's archive office would need to provide. I had emailed the archive office on my 2nd day. I received an auto-response. I emailed again on the 14th day and received a reply from a department assistant who told me the code would need to come from the collections director, who was on extended leave. I sent the collections director an email. Nothing came back. The padlock on the 22nd day was open, not broken. The shackle was simply resting unlatched, the mechanism disengaged, hanging from the cabinet's handle the way a lock hangs when someone has recently used it and not quite closed it again. I stood in front of it for a moment that was longer than I will admit. There was no explanation available. Darrell had been the last person in the building before me. Darrell did not have the combination, or had told me at least that he did not. I told myself that the lock had probably been left this way for a while, and I had simply not examined it closely enough on previous days. I told myself this was the kind of discovery that happens in archival work. Things left in ambiguous states by people who came before. Institutional memory failing at the hinge points. I told myself all of this, and I opened the cabinet. Inside were 6 folders, no red tags, no labels on the spines. The folders were a thicker stock than the rest of Vance's documentation, and the covers were a cream color that had yellowed at the edges in a way that suggested significant age, older than most of the collection, if the paper condition was any measure. I took the first folder to the archive table and opened it. The file concerned a patient identified in the documentation only as Subject Renault, no first name, no intake date. The initial assessment page described injuries of a scope that Vance's notes called, in that precise, economical hand, unprecedented in scope of facial tissue loss. There were diagrams. The diagrams showed what had been present and what was no longer present, rendered with the same clinical care as the rest of the collection. But the scope of the loss was something the clean lines of the diagram could not quite contain. An entire upper structure gone, ocular damage on the right side complete. The tongue partially, the palate, the cheeks. What remained was a lower jaw, a left eye, and a forehead. And Vance's note beside the diagram said, simply, that what remained was not enough to constitute an expression. I set that page aside and kept reading. Subject Renault had been brought to Vance's facility. Not a military hospital, I noticed, but a private medical practice in New Orleans, somewhere in the Garden District, in the early 1920s, by a third party whose identity Vance did not record. The notes on Renaud's condition were meticulous. The notes on his recovery were not present. There were 2 pages of surgical planning. Procedures Vance had proposed, drawn from techniques he had documented from the German and British reconstructive programs. And then, on the 6th page, a note in a different ink, written in the margin, in a hand that was smaller and less controlled than Vance's usual script. The note said, "He does not stay in the room I leave him in." I read that sentence 3 times. I checked the hand against other margin annotations in the folder. It was Vance's handwriting. It was simply different. The kind of different that happens to a person's script when they are writing quickly, or when they are writing in the dark, or when they are not entirely calm. I turned to the next page. The next page was not documentation. It was a letter. It was addressed to no one. It was dated 1926, and it read, in full, "I have come to understand that what I believed was a medical problem is something I do not have the correct category for. Renault moves without sound. He has been in this building for 4 months, and I cannot account for where he goes or when. I have cataloged his face 3 times now, believing each time that I was documenting a recovery. And each time the documentation does not match what I find when I look. I do not know what I am looking at. I know only that whatever is behind his remaining eye is not diminishing. It is accumulating. The letter did not have an ending. The last line simply stopped, mid-thought, the pen trailing slightly, as if Vance had put it down with some urgency and not picked it back up. I sat with the letter for a while. Outside, the rain had arrived while I was reading. I had not noticed it beginning, only realized it was there when it was already full and heavy on the roof. That soft, irregular percussion I had grown accustomed to, but louder now, and with something in the rhythm that I could not immediately explain. Not fingers, I told myself. Just rain on an old flat roof. An acoustical quality of the building, the cedar ceiling absorbing and redistributing the sound unevenly. I was reaching for the second folder when I became aware that I was not alone in the room. I did not see anyone. That is the important part to understand. I did not see a figure. I did not hear footsteps. I did not have the kind of experience that you can point to afterward and say, yes, there, that was the moment. What I had was something underneath all of those things. A shift in the quality of the air. The way the air in a room shifts when a door has been opened somewhere further in the building, and a pressure change so slight it registers below the threshold of what most people would call noticing. I registered it. Every hair on my forearms registered it at almost exactly the same moment. I stayed where I was. I did not call out. Calling out was something I considered and rejected without quite knowing why. There was something in me that did not want to hear what my own voice would sound like in that room, in that moment, as if hearing it would confirm something I was not ready to confirm. The smell changed. This is the detail I have tried, 8 months later, to describe to people who were not there, and the description always sounds less than what it was. It was not the formaldehyde smell of the archive room. It was not the damp of the East Wing. It was something older and more intimate than either. A smell that belonged to a human body. A smell of old skin and something beneath old skin. Something preserved but not clean. The way a thing smells when it has been kept rather than allowed to end. I turned around. There was no one there. The archive room was exactly as it had been. The metal shelving in its rows. The cataloging table with its lamp and my notes. The cabinet standing open. And the folder with Vance's letter open in front of me. The door to the outer corridor was closed. The high, narrow windows showed nothing but the gray, moving sky and the tops of the cypress trees bending in the weather. I turned back to the table. The letter was no longer open. The folder was closed. I had not closed it. I stood in front of the table, and I breathed. My breath was shorter than it should have been, and shallower, and I was aware of my own heartbeat in my ears in a way that made the room feel smaller, the ceiling lower, and the shelving on either side of me closer. I picked up the folder and opened it again. The letter was there. The pages were in order. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been moved inside the folder. Only the folder itself had been closed. I looked at the cabinet. All 6 folders were still inside it. I had not moved the folder. I was entirely certain of this. I told myself I must have. I told myself the action had been automatic, the kind of unconscious gesture a person makes when absorbed in reading, closing a page before they have finished with it, without being aware of the movement. I told myself this was an old building, and it settled in the rain, and things shifted. I told myself all of this in the space of about 45 seconds, standing at the archive table with the folder in my hands. And the whole time I was telling myself these things, I was also listening, as carefully as I had listened to anything in my life, to the room around me. The smell was gone. The rain continued. The room was empty. I set the folder down. I did not open it again that day. I wrote 3 words in my site log: weather affecting access, and I collected my things, and I left the archive room and drove back to the rental house in Bro Bridge, where I sat in the kitchen for a long time, without turning on any lights, watching the rain come down the windows, thinking about a letter written in 1926 by a man describing something that accumulated behind a single remaining eye. I did not sleep well, but I did sleep. And in the morning I drove back. Darrell was not there on the 23rd day. He had called the university. The archive office relayed a message to say that the family matter in Opelousas would require another day. The facility was mine. I opened the archive room. The cabinet was closed, and the padlock was latched. I stood in front of it for a moment, and then I looked at the combination mechanism and tried the only sequence I had: Darrell's employee number, which he had used for the outer gate, and the padlock did not open. I stood in front of the closed cabinet, and I looked at the archive table, and I looked at the place on the table where Vance's folder had been sitting when I left the night before. It was not there. I had not taken it. I checked my bag. I checked the outer corridor. The folder was not anywhere I could account for. The cabinet was locked. The folder was not on the table. The folder was not in my bag, not in the outer corridor, not in the building's small break room, not anywhere in the East Wing storage space, which I checked because I had no other options left. The folder was gone, and the cabinet was locked, and I had not locked it, and I had not taken the folder. I sat down at the archive table, and I held very still for a time I did not measure. I thought about Subject Renault. I thought about Vance's letter, and specifically, I thought about the phrase I had been turning in my mind since the night before. The way you turn something sharp to look at all its edges. Whatever is behind his remaining eye is not diminishing. It is accumulating. I thought about the 9 red-tagged folders and the 1 photograph I had spent 4 minutes looking at, and the unsteadiness of my hands when I put it down. I thought about a man who had lost everything between his forehead and his jaw, who had been brought to a private practice in New Orleans in the early 1920s, and who, according to a doctor's escalating, handwritten record, did not stay in the rooms he was left in. I thought about the smell. The room was still and dry and entirely without that smell, and I knew, in the way that you know things in your body before you have finished constructing the thought, that this was not reassurance. This was a state that would change. This was a room in which I had already discovered one shift in the quality of the air. And that shift had been real, and the smell had been real, and the folder was gone, and I had not moved it. I picked up my phone to call Darrell. The battery was at 4%. I had charged it the night before. I had checked it in the parking lot 30 minutes ago, and it had been at 87%. 4% is not a number that is produced by 30 minutes of standby use. I called Darrell. The call connected. I heard his voice say my name once with a question in it, and then the line dropped and the phone powered off. I sat in the silence that followed that call for a long time without moving. I noticed, in that silence, that I was wondering whether I had left the stove on back at the rental house that morning. A completely ordinary, completely useless thought, arriving in the middle of something I had no tools to address. My mind reaching for something small and solvable. I noticed the thought and let it pass because there was nowhere to go with it, and because something else was arriving. The shift in the air came from the direction of the cabinet. I was looking at the cabinet when I felt it. That same almost negligible pressure change, that same below-threshold movement in the atmosphere of the room. And as I watched, the padlock on the cabinet made a small, clean, metallic sound, and the shackle released, and the cabinet swung open on its own by approximately 2 inches. The 6 folders were inside. Vance's folder was at the front of the row, returned to its position, its cream-colored cover unmarked. I did not approach the cabinet. I simply did not approach it. I sat at the archive table with my hands flat on its surface, and I looked at the 2-inch gap in the cabinet door, and I breathed, and I counted my breaths, and after some time the smell arrived. It was subtle at first. That first trace of something old and preserved and not entirely finished, arriving in the cooled archive air the way something arrives that has been there all along and is simply now closer. I looked at the far end of the room. There was nothing there. There was the end of the last row of shelving, and the plain beige wall behind it, and the single overhead fluorescent light, steady and unchanged. There was nothing there that had not been there before. There was a shadow on the wall that was not consistent with the angle of the overhead light. It was not large. It was approximately the size and shape that a person standing at a slight distance from the wall would cast, and it was still, and it had an upper edge that was not the clean, simple curve of a human head, but something less complete, something interrupted, something that stopped before it should have stopped. I looked at the shadow, and I did not look away from it, and it did not move, and I did not move, and the smell in the room grew stronger. From somewhere in the building, not the archive room itself, but somewhere behind the wall to my left, in the sealed portion of the east wing that had been damp since before Darrell's tenure, I heard a sound. I cannot describe it accurately. It was not a footstep, and it was not a knock, and it was not the building settling in the rain. It was the sound of something moving, without the full mechanics of movement, without the ordinary weight and sequence a human body putting itself from one place to another. It came once and did not repeat, and when it stopped, the shadow on the far wall was gone, and the smell began to recede, and the cabinet door swung slowly back to its 2-inch opening and rested there. I got up. I walked to the outer corridor. I walked through the outer corridor to the front door of the building. I pushed the door open and stood in the rain, in the parking lot, in the wet gravel smell of the outside world for a very long time. I went back inside. I do not fully know why. Partly, it was the same mechanism that had brought me to Louisiana in the first place. That particular absence of self-preservation that comes from a grief that has not finished working through you, the way that exhaustion and loss can hollow out the space where caution normally lives. Partly it was that the rational part of my mind was still, even then, insisting on an accounting. A shadow explained by a light source I had misidentified. A smell from the building's own damp biology. A cabinet lock that was less secure than it appeared. A folder that I had, in some moment of abstraction, moved myself. But partly it was something else, something I am less comfortable naming. The letter had said that whatever lived behind subject Renaud's remaining I was accumulating. And I had sat in that room and felt something attend to me, something that had stood in a corner and waited for me to notice it. And when I thought about that, when I really let myself think about it, what I felt was not purely fear. There was something in the quality of that attention that was exhausted and old and had been waiting for a very long time. And I think that in the weeks of quiet work among Vance's records of broken and reconstructed men, I had come to understand something about waiting that I had not understood before. I went back to the archive room. The shadow was not there. The smell was not there. The cabinet door was exactly 2 inches open, and inside it, the 6 folders sat in their row. I took Vance's folder from the cabinet and I opened it. Behind the letter, which I had not yet read, there were 3 more pages. The first was another surgical diagram, a proposed reconstruction plan, detailed and ambitious, the kind of plan that a doctor would draw, who believed in the redemptive possibilities of his own craft. The second page was a post-operative note, dated several months after the letter, and it was almost entirely composed of the same sentence, repeated in different forms. The reconstruction is holding, and the face is present, and the face is stable, and the reconstruction has produced the expected result. The repetition had the quality of insistence, the quality of a person talking to convince themselves of something they were not certain of. The third page was not a medical document. It was a short piece of text in Vance's hand, written without a date, without a heading, without any of the documentary infrastructure of the rest of the collection. It said, "Renaud is gone. I believe he left during the night of the 14th, though I cannot be certain because I have not been monitoring the building after dark for some weeks now. Because of what I have seen in the building after dark, the reconstruction is physically complete. The face I built is present and stable and anatomically coherent. I have looked at it carefully, and I cannot find any fault in the surgical outcome. But I want to say, for the record, and I do not know who this record is for, that the face I built is not the same as a face. A face has a direction. A face has somewhere it is looking from. What I built on Renault is a surface, and behind that surface something is looking outward that was looking outward before I began, and will be looking outward long after every record I have ever made is sealed in a cabinet in a building that no one is visiting anymore. I do not know where he has gone. I hope he has gone somewhere he is not known. I hope also that he is not still in this building. I finished the cataloging contract. It took 3 more weeks, and I was there most days from 8 to 5. And nothing happened in those 3 weeks that I cannot account for with straightforward explanations. The cabinet stayed accessible. The 6 folders were there each morning, and I worked through them systematically and logged them with the same care I had brought to everything else. The smell did not return. The shadow did not return. The sound from the east wing did not repeat. On my last day, Darrell helped me carry the equipment to my car and signed off on the final site log. At the gate, he shouldered it open with both hands and held it while I drove through, and I stopped and rolled down the window because I wanted to ask him about the prior researchers, about why the cataloging had stopped 4 years ago, about what the special handling flag on the locked cabinet had originally been intended to convey. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, in the quiet, unhurried way he said everything, that the 2 researchers before me had both left before their contracts ended. He said the first one, a woman from a university in Baton Rouge, had told him on her last day that she found the building too quiet. He said the second one, a younger man, had simply stopped coming. I thanked him and drove the 11 hours north with all the windows up. Not because it was cold, it was September and still warm, but because I did not want any outside air in the car. I arrived home feeling, for the first time since April, something that I could almost describe as relief. I unpacked my bags. I went to bed early. At some point in the night, I woke to a smell in the room that I recognized before I was fully awake. I lay on my back in the dark, and I breathed it in. Old skin and something below old skin. Something preserved but not finished. And I stayed very still. And I did not look toward the corner of the room where the quality of the darkness was slightly wrong, where the shadow was not quite the right shape for a room with no one else in it. I closed my eyes. In the morning, the smell was gone. But sometimes, on nights when the room is too quiet, when my own city falls into one of those strange temporary silences that cities occasionally fall into for no reason that can be explained, I lie in the dark and I become aware of the air in the room shifting slightly, and a quality of attention settling over me that is not hostile and is not comfortable and is simply and entirely old. And I understand in those moments that whatever accumulated behind that remaining eye has been accumulating for a very long time, and that it has not stopped yet. I have been a long-haul trucker for 19 years, and I have driven through every kind of dark this country makes. Mountain dark, desert dark, and the flat, relentless dark of the Kansas plains at 2 in the morning when there is nothing on either side of the highway for 40 miles in any direction. I know the difference between a road playing tricks on a tired mind and a road showing you something real. What I saw on the night of November 14th on Interstate 40 heading east through the Pigeon River Gorge in the Cherokee National Forest was real. I know this because I was not alone. My co-driver saw it too, and she has not spoken about it since. And that silence from a woman who has an opinion on everything and has never once in 11 years of driving together been at a loss for words is the most frightening part of the whole account. I want to tell you about Darlene first, because Darlene is the reason this account carries the weight it carries. And because understanding who she is makes her silence afterward into the thing it actually is, which is not nothing. Darlene Marsh is 53 years old, and she has been driving long haul since she was 26, and she has logged more miles than any other driver in the history of the company we work for, a regional carrier out of Memphis that runs the southeastern corridor. And she has opinions on tire pressure and CB etiquette and the best truck stop between here and Jacksonville. And she will share those opinions with you, whether you have requested them or not. And she has been my co-driver for 11 years. And in those 11 years, I have never once seen her without a response to something. She is also the most observant person I have ever worked alongside. Not in a trained way, not in the way of someone who has been taught to look. In the way of someone whose attention is simply structured differently than most people's, who notices things at the edge of the visual field that other people register only as a vague unease without a source, and who can tell you what was wrong with a road before she has consciously identified what she saw. I tell you this because on the night of November 14th, Darlene was the one who saw it first. We had picked up a load in Knoxville at 9 in the evening, medical equipment heading to Charlotte, time sensitive, which meant no extended stops, and a schedule that put us through the gorge at approximately 2:40 in the morning. This is not unusual. We run the gorge at night more often than in daylight, because the daytime construction delays on I-40 through that stretch can add an hour to the run. And on a time-sensitive load, an hour matters. I know that road in the dark. I know where the grades are and where the ice forms first and where the rock face comes closest to the lane and where the viaducts begin and end. I have driven the Pigeon River Gorge in November dark at least 30 times in 11 years of this route, and it has never been anything but a hard road that requires attention and rewards competence. What I am going to tell you happened on the 31st or 32nd time, and it was not like the other 30. We entered the gorge at the Tennessee side at 2:31 in the morning. I know the time because I noted it, which is a habit on that stretch, because the cellular dead zone begins at the state line, and on a time-sensitive medical load, I always note the time we enter and exit the dead zone so I can account for the gap if dispatch tries to reach us. 2:31. The temperature is 22 degrees. The road surface was clear on the Tennessee side, but with ice warning signs beginning at the first tunnel, which was consistent with the overnight forecast. Darlene was in the passenger seat, not sleeping, because Darlene does not sleep in the gorge. She has never explained this to me, and I have never asked, because there are things about the way Darlene operates that are simply facts about her, and do not require accounting for. She was looking at the road ahead the way she looks at things, with that specific structured attention of hers. And I was driving, and the gorge was doing what the gorge does in November at that hour, which is hold the dark in a way that flat country does not hold it. The rock walls on both sides, making the headlights work differently, bouncing the light back before it can reach its full distance, and creating a quality of compressed illumination, as if the light cannot get out. The first tunnel takes about 40 seconds at our speed. Inside the tunnel, the ice on the road surface catches the headlights and makes the road look wet rather than frozen, which is the specific optical trick that causes accidents in that tunnel every winter, and which I know to account for. I came through the tunnel at an appropriate speed for the conditions, the truck handling correctly, nothing unusual. We came out the other side. Darlene said, "What is that?" She said it quietly, without alarm, in the specific register she uses when she has seen something and is asking me to confirm it before she decides what it is. She has used that register twice in 11 years, both times for road hazards, both times correctly. I looked where she was looking. The road ahead curved right, following the gorge, and on the left shoulder, at the guardrail, at the point where the guardrail separated the road surface from the drop to the river below, something was standing. I want to be methodical, because methodical is what I have. It was on the left shoulder, which is the river side, which means it was standing at the guardrail with the gorge behind it, and the river somewhere in the dark below. This is relevant because the left shoulder in the gorge is not a place a person stands. There is no access to the gorge from the left shoulder. There is nothing on the left shoulder except the guardrail and the rock face and the river. A person standing on the left shoulder of I-40 in the Pigeon River Gorge at 2:40 in the morning in November has come from somewhere that does not have a road to it. It was tall, that registered before anything else, the same way it always registers before anything else, in the chest rather than the head, as a physical fact rather than an observed detail. It was tall enough that the scale was wrong for the setting, wrong for a human figure standing at a guardrail, wrong in the specific way that a thing is wrong when it is the size that it is in a context that does not accommodate that size. Its arms were at its sides. I had approximately 4 seconds of it in the headlights before the curve took it out of our sight line. In those 4 seconds, I saw the height, the arms, the position at the guardrail, and one other thing. It was facing the river, not the road, not the truck. The river, which was in the gorge below the guardrail, which was invisible in the dark, which was audible through the truck's ventilation as a low and continuous sound of moving water. It was facing the river, and it did not turn when the headlights reached it, and it did not move. I drove through the curve. I said, "Did you see that?" Darlene said, "Yes." I said, "What was it?" She said, "I do not know." In 11 years, Darlene has never said "I do not know" about something on a road. She has said the wrong size tire for the load, and she has said black ice at the next curve, and she has said that car has been following us since Cookville, and she is always right, and "I do not know" is not in her usual inventory. I drove. The gorge does not allow for stopping. There are no pull-offs on the left side, and the right side pull-offs are for emergency use. And stopping on the road surface itself in a fully loaded tractor trailer in November in the gorge is not a decision I was going to make. I drove, and the curve straightened, and the next section of the gorge opened ahead of us. The headlights reaching the rock face on the right and the guardrail on the left and the road between them. The smell came through the ventilation at approximately the same time. I have described smells before in the context of that gorge, and the gorge has a smell, diesel and pine and cold stone and river water, that I know the way I know the road itself. This was underneath that. Something that the gorge smell was sitting on top of. Something that did not belong to the road or the river or the rock or the diesel or the forest on the ridgeline above the rock cuts. Darlene said, "You smell that?" I said, "Yes." She said nothing else. The ventilation was pulling outside air. I switched it to recirculate. The smell did not leave immediately, which is the thing I noted, because recirculate means interior air only, which means the smell that stayed after the switch had already established itself in the cab rather than arriving continuously from outside. Whatever it was, it had been in the cab for longer than the moment I noticed it. I kept both hands on the wheel, and I drove the speed I was driving, and I watched the road. There are 3 more significant curves in the gorge before the grade levels, and the road straightens toward the North Carolina side. I know each of them by their characteristics. The first drops slightly before it curves, which causes the loaded trailer to push against the fifth wheel in a way I compensate for automatically. The second has the worst ice formation of the 3, where the rock face on the right drains directly onto the road surface. The third is the longest, a sweeping left curve that takes almost a full minute at our speed, and that comes out onto the final viaduct before the gorge opens into the French Broad Valley. I navigated the first one. I navigated the second one. On the third, the long, sweeping left, I saw it again. It was on the right side this time, the rock face's side, standing between the road surface and the rock wall, in the 3 or 4 feet of shoulder that exist on the right side of that curve, in a space that I can tell you with certainty is not accessible from any point above or below, because I know what is above it, which is a blasted rock face, and I know what is below it, which is the road bed itself. It had not come from anywhere that I could account for. It was facing the road this time, and it was closer to the lane than it had been the first time. I want to be precise about the distance because distance matters. The first sighting was at the guardrail, which is approximately 8 feet from the right edge of the travel lane. This sighting was at approximately 4 feet. In the space of however many minutes and however many miles of gorge road between the first sighting and the second, it had moved from 8 feet to 4 feet. Getting closer, always getting closer. Its arms were at its sides. Its face was toward the road. I had the same problem with the face that I have had every time I have tried to describe a face in the dark, which is that there was a face in the location where a face should be, and in the location where the eyes should be there was something that was not shadow and was not a feature but was a density, an absorption, a place where the headlights went and did not come back from. 3 seconds in the headlights, gone as the curve completed itself. I said right side that time. Darlene said, I know. I said closer. She said, I know. I said, Darlene. She said, drive, so I drove. I drove the last mile of the gorge with both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road surface, and the specific, deliberate attention of a person who has made a professional decision, which was that, whatever was in the gorge with us, the road still required the road's full attention, and that the road had killed people who gave it less than that, and I was not going to be one of them. The gorge opened onto the viaduct. The viaduct is the last section before the French Broad Valley, and it is the section I have always found the most beautiful on a clear night, because you come out of the enclosed gorge, and suddenly there is sky above you, and the valley ahead, and the river visible below in the moonlight, if there is moonlight, and the compressed dark of the gorge releases all at once. That night there was no moonlight. There was low overcast, and the valley was dark, and the sky was the flat black of a November sky that is holding weather. I drove onto the viaduct. At the midpoint of the viaduct, which spans the river at a height of approximately 160 feet, Darlene made a sound. Not a word. A sound, the kind that comes from the body rather than from a decision, the kind I had made myself on 2 or 3 occasions in the gorge, and that I recognized immediately as involuntary. I said, "What?" she said. "Do not look left." I looked left. There was nothing on the left side of the viaduct. The barrier and the dark and the valley below and the overcast sky and the sound of the river 160 feet below. And nothing else. I said, "What did you see?" She said, "Drive." I drove off the viaduct and onto the grade that descends toward Waterville, and I drove the grade and I drove the 5 miles to the interchange, and I pulled into the truck stop at the bottom of the grade, and I put the truck in park, and I sat there. Darlene got out. She went inside the truck stop, and she bought 2 coffees, and she came back, and she handed me one, and she got in and she drank hers, and I drank mine, and neither of us said anything for approximately 10 minutes. Then I said, "What did you see on the viaduct?" She looked at her coffee. She said nothing. I said, "Darlene," she said, "nothing that I am going to put words to, because putting words to something gives it a shape, and I do not want that thing to have a shape in my head. That is the most I have gotten from her in 8 months. She still drives the route. She still goes through the gorge. She does not talk about it before the gorge, and she does not talk about it after. And when I have tried to approach it sideways, In the careful way you approach the things that people you care about have closed, she redirects with a completeness that tells me the door is not stuck, the door is locked, and she is the one holding the key, and she has made a decision about it. I have respected that, but I have not been able to do what she has done, which is close the door and hold the key, because I am not built that way, and because the two sightings in the gorge, the one at the guardrail and the one at the rock face, and whatever Darlene saw on the viaduct that she will not put into words, have not arranged themselves into a shape I can set down. I have driven I-40 through the Pigeon River Gorge 14 times since November 14th. Every time I enter the dead zone at the Tennessee state line, I note the time, the way I always have. Every time I come out the other side at Waterville, I note the time. And every time, without planning to, I check the numbers. Every time the transit time through the gorge is within a minute of what it should be, given our speed and the conditions, except for the night of November 14th. The night of November 14th, the gap between entry and exit was 19 minutes longer than it should have been. 11 miles of gorge road at our speed, in the conditions we were in, takes approximately 14 minutes. We were in the gorge for 33 minutes. I noticed this when I reviewed the logs the following week, and I sat with it for a long time, and I thought about the two sightings and the smell and Darlene's sound on the viaduct and the coffee at the truck stop and the 10 minutes of silence. And I thought about 19 minutes that I cannot locate in my memory of that transit.
Not a gap, exactly. Not a blank.
The memory of the gorge is continuous. The first tunnel and the curve and the left shoulder and the right shoulder and the viaduct and the valley opening up. The memory plays at normal speed. It is just shorter than 33 minutes. It is just missing 19 of them. I called the Cherokee Nation Cultural Preservation Office 3 months after the night of November 14th. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I am not a person with expertise in that area, and I did not approach it as someone seeking confirmation of something I already believed. I approached it the way I approach things I do not understand, which is as a source of information that I do not have, and that someone else might. I spoke to a man there, a patient and thoughtful man who asked careful questions and listened carefully to the answers, and who did not rush me. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the gorge had a presence in the oral tradition of his community that predated the road by as long as anyone could trace, and that the presence was associated with the high passes, and with the deep water, and with the hours before dawn in the cold months, and that it was not considered malevolent in the tradition, but was considered very old and very aware, and that the tradition did not encourage direct engagement with it. He said the tradition was also specific about the viaduct. I said the viaduct was built in the 1960s. The tradition cannot be specific about the viaduct. He said the viaduct crosses the river at the same point where the river runs deepest in the gorge, and that the tradition was specific about that point on the river which had been known long before the road, and that the thing the tradition said about that point was this: it is where the watcher comes closest to the water, and where the water and the watcher are closest to the same thing, and those who cross that point in the dark hours should cross it without looking down. I said my co-driver was the one who looked. He said, yes, I said, and she will not talk about what she saw. He said, that is consistent. He said it the way Arvid Leighton said things, and the way the old letter from Washington County said things, in the register of a fact about a place, rather than a claim about the extraordinary. And I recognized the register, and I understood, in the moment of recognizing it, that some things have been known for a very long time by the people who have lived alongside them, and that the road through the gorge and the trucks on it, and the cellular dead zone and the dispatch schedules are a very recent layer on top of something very old that does not know about any of them. I still drive the route. I still go through the gorge. I note the entry time and the exit time, and I have never again had a gap that does not account for itself. And I do not know if that means anything, or if it means the night of November 14th was the only night, or the first night, or a night that was particular in some way I will never have the information to understand. I do not look left on the viaduct. Darlene sits in the passenger seat, and she does not look left either. And we do not discuss the not looking, because there are things between people who have worked alongside each other for 11 years that do not need to be discussed. Things that live in the shared practice rather than in the shared language. We come out of the gorge on the North Carolina side, and Darlene pours coffee from the thermos she keeps behind her seat, and she hands me a cup without being asked. And I drive the grade down toward Waterville, and the valley opens up ahead of us. And the gorge is behind us, and neither of us looks back. That is the agreement. It is the only agreement we have ever needed to put in place. And we put it in place without saying it. On the night of November 14th, at a truck stop at the bottom of the grade, over 2 coffees in 10 minutes of silence, and it has held for 8 months without a word to maintain it. Some agreements are like that. The ones that matter most are always like that. What I carry from that night, besides the 19 minutes and the sightings and the smell and Darlene's sound on the viaduct, is something smaller than all of those things, and more persistent than any of them. It is the fact that it was facing the river the first time, not the truck, not the road, the river. Whatever it was, in the gorge in November at 2:40 in the morning, it was not there because of us. We came through its space, and it registered us, and it turned toward us, and it closed the distance between itself and the road. But it had been there before we arrived. It was there before the road was there. It will be there after the road is gone. We passed through something that was not built for us, and does not require us, and does not particularly need us to believe in it. And the only honest thing I know how to end with is this: 11 miles, 14 minutes at speed, 33 minutes on the log. Somewhere in those 19 minutes, Something in the Pigeon River Gorge had our full attention. I cannot account for those 19 minutes. I cannot account for what Darlene saw. And on the nights when I am through the gorge and the grade is behind me and the valley is ahead and the coffee is in my hand and Darlene is in her seat and neither of us is looking back, I think about the man from the Cultural Preservation Office and the thing he said about the Watcher and the water and the deep point of the river. And I think about how old a thing has to be to have a tradition built around it. And I think about how many trucks have gone through that gorge in the decades since the road was built. And how many of those drivers noted the entry time and noted the exit time and never once found a gap in the numbers. And I think about why the gap was there on that night, on our night, and whether it will be there again. And I drive, because driving is what there is. And the road goes forward, and I do not look back. There is a smell I cannot get out of my car, even now, even after I had it cleaned twice and drove with the windows down through 2 weeks of Tennessee rain. It is the smell of something standing very close to you in the dark, earth and copper, and something older than both. I first noticed it the night I drove alone through Harlan County, and by the time I understood what was walking beside me on Route 83, I was already 30 miles past the place where I should have stopped. I have never gone back. I was on road. What matters is the road, and the reason I was on it, and the particular quality of stillness that a very tall figure has when it is standing at the shoulder of a 2-lane highway in southeastern Kentucky. And it is 2 in the morning, and the rain has just stopped, and everything around you carries the specific, saturated quiet that follows rain in October in the mountains. I am going to tell you what I saw. I am going to be precise about it because imprecision is what lets people explain things away, and I do not want this explained away. Not because I need you to believe me, but because I need to say it in a form that is accurate, and I have been composing it in my head for 11 months, and this is the most accurate form I have found. So, the road, the night, what was standing on it? I had been in Harlan 3 days for a reason that is both simple and the kind of thing that takes weeks to carry. My grandmother had died in September, and her house on Cranks Creek Road needed to be emptied before the 1st of November, when the property transferred to the county. She had lived in that house for 61 years. There was a lot inside it. I was the only one who could go. My father grew up in that house and could not bring himself to make the drive. My mother had offered to come, but she did not know the house the way I did not know which boxes in the back bedroom were worth opening, and which ones my grandmother had kept closed, for reasons she never explained to anyone. I knew the house. I had spent every summer of my childhood inside it, on the screened porch, with its rusted wind chimes, and its view of the creek, in the kitchen where the linoleum was lifting at the seam by the back door, in the narrow upstairs hallway where a mirror had hung for so long that when my uncle finally took it down the summer before she died, you could see the clean rectangle of wall it had been protecting all those years, pale against the yellow the rest of the hallway had slowly become. I was 33 years old, and I was clearing out my grandmother's house. And on the third evening, I drove to the grocery in town for the last time, bought a sandwich and a bottle of water and a bag of chips I did not particularly want, and I started the long drive back to Louisville. I should have left that morning. I know that now. 11 months of knowing it has not changed the fact that I did not. I left at 11:45 at night because I wanted to be finished. Because the house was empty in the way that houses are empty when the person who made them what they were is gone. And that particular emptiness has a weight that is different from ordinary emptiness, heavier and more directional, pressing against you from every room at once. I could not sleep in it one more time. I am the kind of person who would rather drive 4 hours in the dark than lie on a narrow mattress and listen to old tempter settle and wait for a morning that is taking too long. That is my vulnerability. It is not a dramatic one. It is the ordinary, very human need to be moving when stillness becomes unbearable. Route 83 south of Harlan is not a road that rewards inattention. It curves along the creek valley with the mountain pressing down from the east and the tree line close on both sides. And in October, when the leaves have come down and the branches are bare, the headlights catch them crossing overhead, and they look in the wrong moment like hands reaching across the road toward each other. I was not frightened when I started driving. I was tired and sad, and carrying the weight of 3 days spent sorting through a dead woman's accumulated life. And the road was wet from the rain that had ended about an hour before, and the asphalt was still holding the water, reflecting my headlights back at me in long broken ribbons. I had the radio on. Something country, something with a steady beat and a familiar structure. The kind of music built specifically to keep a person company on a dark road without demanding that they think too hard about anything. The first wrong detail was so small that I very nearly filed it away as nothing. About 8 miles outside of Harlan, on the long straight section before the road bends south toward Cranks, there is a stretch of shoulder that broadens, the kind of wide shoulder that gathers debris over the years, old tire rubber, a plastic bag wound through a guardrail post, the dried and cracked shreds of a blown-out, retreaded truck tire that people in this part of Kentucky call a road gator. The road gator was there. I had passed it on the drive into town 2 days before and registered it without caring. But tonight, something was standing next to it. I caught it in the periphery, on the right side of the road, and I did not fully process it in time to look directly at it. My headlights touched the edge of whatever it was for. Perhaps a second and a half, and then I was past it, and in the rearview mirror the road behind me was dark and empty and entirely ordinary. I told myself it was a person waiting for a ride. I told myself this because it was the available explanation. And because the mind is very efficient at selecting the available explanation when the alternative would require it to sit with something it is not equipped to sit with. I drove. The radio played. The road curved south. I thought about my grandmother's wind chimes. She had 3 sets on the screened porch, and they were all different. One bamboo, one aluminum, one made from seashells she had collected on the single trip to the coast she ever took in 1972, before my father was born. I had wrapped them carefully in newspaper and put them in a box I had labeled Porch Things, because I could not write her name on a box yet. That was the kind of thought I was carrying on Route 83 at midnight in October, and it is important to understand that, because what came next arrived into the middle of that quiet grief, into the middle of wind chimes and newspaper, and a road I had driven since childhood, and it arrived without announcement. The smell came through the ventilation. I had the system set to outside air because the heater had been making a clicking noise I did not trust, and the smell entered without any warning at all. I have tried over 11 months to find the right word for it, and the closest I have arrived at is wrong. Not decay, not chemical, something older than both of those things. The way the air smells in the bottom of a well, or in a room that has been closed for a very long time, or, and this is the comparison that came to me in the car that night, and that I have not been able to set aside since. The way a person smells when they have been outside in the cold for so long that their skin has gone past cold into something else entirely. I rolled the window down to check whether it was worse outside. It was worse outside. I rolled the window back up. I switched the ventilation to recirculate. I turned the radio louder. I held the steering wheel with both hands, and I kept my eyes forward, and I drove. About 3 miles further south, the road passes under an old coal company overpass, a rusted metal structure that was supposed to come down 20 years ago, and has simply been forgotten instead, the way a great many things in this part of Kentucky have been forgotten. The overpass creates a brief tunnel of dark, perhaps 40 feet of it, where the headlights do not reach the edges of the road. I had driven under that overpass dozens of times over the years without giving it a single thought. Tonight, I did not want to drive under it. That was the first moment I understood that my body knew something my mind was still catching up to. The reluctance was entirely physical. A tightening across my shoulders, a coldness settling in the center of my chest, a breath that I held without deciding to hold it. The way the body holds a breath when it is listening for something it cannot yet hear. I drove under the overpass. In the 40 feet of dark beneath it, I kept my eyes straight ahead. When I came out the other side, he was standing on the left shoulder. He was tall. That is the first thing. And it is the thing I return to whenever I try to describe him to someone who was not there, because the height registered before everything else, not as a detail the eye cataloged and filed, but as something the body understood before the eye had finished looking. He was the wrong size. Not dramatically, not in any theatrical way, in a way that makes the skin on your arms understand the situation before your brain has formed a complete thought about it. He was wearing something light-colored, a jacket or a shirt, or possibly just a paleness of skin that caught the last edge of my headlights as I came out of the shadow and held it for a moment longer than it should have. He was standing approximately 4 feet from the white line, not on the gravel shoulder. On the asphalt itself, close enough to the road that a driver drifting slightly right would have struck him. He was facing the road, the way a person faces a road when they are waiting for a car to slow down. But his arms were at his sides. He was not waving. He was not flagging me down. He was simply positioned there, with his arms hanging at his sides and his face turned toward the road, toward my lights, toward me, and I could not see his eyes. I need to be very precise about this, because it is the detail people want most urgently to rationalize. It was not dark enough that I simply could not make out his face. I could see his face. I could see the structure of it. The jaw, the forehead, in the peripheral wash of my headlights as I passed. But where the eyes should have been, there was simply more face. A flatness. A place where the light arrived and was absorbed rather than returned, the way a photograph looks when something in it has been overexposed until the detail is gone, replaced by a brightness that is somehow also an absence. I passed him at 55 miles per hour. I did not brake. My foot stayed on the accelerator with the rigid, even pressure of a foot that has been told by something in the body that does not issue its orders in words to keep moving. I looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. I drove for about a mile. I ran through the available explanations the way you run through them when you need one. A hitchhiker, a stranded driver, someone who had pulled off the road and gotten out to stand in the cold and wait in the dark at 2 in the morning with his arms at his sides and his face turned toward passing cars and something wrong where his eyes should have been. I almost convinced myself. The mind is very good at almost. There is a gas station about 11 miles south of Harlan, at the junction where a county road branches off toward the creek communities. It stays open through the night because the coal company's second shift ends at 1 in the morning, and the men stop there on their way home. The lights of it appeared around a long curve, and I pulled in before I had consciously decided to. The way you pull into a place when some part of you has made the decision ahead of the rest of you. I got out. The cold came at me immediately, the good kind. The kind that carries air in it and smells like wet clay and dead leaves, and the particular sharpness of October in the mountains. I stood at the pump and listened to the fuel running through the hose, and the tick of the line, and a truck moving on the county road somewhere to the east, and I breathed. I went inside and bought a coffee that had been sitting for hours and tasted like the inside of an old thermos, and I held it in both hands at the counter and let the warmth move through my palms. And in that moment, under those fluorescent lights, with the attendant watching something on a small television behind the counter, and the coolers humming along the back wall, everything that had happened on the road felt, briefly, like something that could be set aside, like something that had its own category, separate from this lit room and this hot cup and this ordinary familiar hour. One sentence of warmth. That is all a dark story ever needs to make the cold feel colder. I got back in the car. I drove south. The road between that junction and the county line runs about 14 miles, and I have known every turn of it since childhood. My grandmother used to take me to town on Saturday mornings, and we always came back this way, and she would point out the farmhouses and tell me who had lived in them, and who had left and who had stayed. I knew where the road rose and where it dipped. I knew the place where the guardrail ended and the shoulder dropped into the creek. I knew the abandoned farmhouse 3 miles past the junction, the one with the caved-in roof and the porch that had slumped into the yard over the decades. The one my grandmother had always told me to stop looking at without ever explaining why, and I had always stopped looking at it without ever asking. 'Cause some instructions carry enough weight in the voice that gives them that you do not need a reason. I was 4 miles past the junction when I saw him again. He was ahead of me, not behind me, not in the place where I had last seen him, 11 miles back. Ahead, around a gradual right-hand curve, in the wash of my headlights before I had fully come around it. Standing on the right shoulder about 30 feet past a line of orange construction barrels set up around a section of damaged guardrail. I had not noticed those barrels on the way in. There had been no construction equipment, no signage, no flaggers. Just 4 barrels in a line, their reflective tape catching my lights in long orange bands. And past them 30 feet past the last one, he was standing. Same height, same arms at his sides, same face turned toward the road. I was close enough this time that I could see his hands before I was past him, and his hands were wrong, not dramatically wrong. Wrong in the specific way that a detail is wrong when it is almost right, but not quite. The fingers slightly too long, or hanging at an angle that fingers do not naturally hang at when they belong to a body that is holding itself upright of its own will. The way fingers look in a textbook illustration. The way they look when the person they belong to is no longer making any of the small, continuous adjustments that living bodies make without being asked. I was past him. I looked in the mirror. He was in the center of the road, not on the shoulder, in the lane. Standing in the lane I had just left, facing the direction my taillights were moving, and closer. I want to be plain about this. Closer than he had been when I passed him. Not by a small margin. By enough that the proportions were wrong. By enough that if I had been outside the car, I could have read the detail of him. But I was inside the car and I was watching him shrink in the mirror as I drove away from him, and he was not moving. And the road was otherwise empty, and the construction barrels were where they had been, and none of it formed a shape my mind was able to hold. My vision was narrowing at the edges, pulling in the periphery, going soft and gray, the way vision behaves when the body has quietly decided what it is and is not willing to process. My hands were trembling, the specific, fine tremor that lives in the fingers when they are trying to do something precise, and the body has other priorities. I notice this in the detached way you notice physical facts when the mind is occupied with something else entirely. I turned on the interior dome light. I cannot fully explain why. There was no darkness inside the car that needed addressing. But I needed something to change, and that was the thing I could change. And so I changed it. And the cab went from dark to a dim yellow-white. And it helped, not at all, and also a little, the way a very small action helps when a very large thing is happening. And then the cognitive retreat arrived the way it always arrives. Sudden, mundane, complete. I was thinking about whether I had turned the kitchen light off in my grandmother's house before I left. That was what occupied me, not the figure in the road, the kitchen light, whether it was on, whether Delmar, the neighbor 3 houses down who had the spare key, would see it through the window and think someone had gotten in and call the county. I thought about this with remarkable focus for approximately 30 seconds. The kitchen light and the spare key, and Delmar, who was 78 years old and had been my grandmother's neighbor for 4 decades, and who had held one of her seashell wind chimes in his hands for a long time when I brought it to him, and had not said anything at all for a while. And the not saying anything had been a whole conversation. The kitchen light, the spare key. I came around the long curve where the road straightens for the last 3 miles before the county line. He was standing in the center of the road, not the shoulder, the center. In my lane, directly ahead of me, close enough that my headlights reached him cleanly, far enough that I had time to see him clearly before I reached him. And the clarity was the worst part of it, because clarity is what you believe you want when you are frightened, and clarity was exactly what made this worse. He was taller than I had understood the first 2 times. Perhaps I had not had the angle. Perhaps some things reveal their true scale only when there is nowhere left to look but directly at them. His arms were at his sides. His fingers hung the way they had the second time. His face was angled toward my headlights, toward the road, toward me, and where his eyes should have been was what had been there since the first sighting, not darkness, not shadow, but a flatness, a density, a place where light landed and was absorbed completely, returning nothing, the way a hole returns nothing that is lowered into it. He did not move. I did not stop. There was a moment, I will not pretend there was not, where my foot lifted slightly from the accelerator, where something that was not courage and was not reason considered the possibility of stopping. The kind of consideration that arrives when you have gone far past frightened and come out the other side into something flatter and stiller and more dangerous. My foot went back down. I drove through the space where he was standing. And the cold came, not a drop in the car's temperature, and not a vent failure, an erasure of warmth, sudden, total, and precise, lasting for the exact duration of my passing through whatever he was. 3 seconds. Beginning at the moment my headlights reached him, and ending at the moment I was past him. In those 3 seconds, the air inside the car was the temperature of a room where nothing warm has ever lived. I made a sound. I did not choose to. It came from somewhere below decision, a low, closed-mouth sound that was not a word, that would not be a word in any language. That was simply what came out of the body when the body had understood something The mind was still refusing to form into a thought. I drove. I drove the last 3 miles to the county line with every light in the car on, both hands on the wheel, my eyes on the road ahead, and I did not look in the rearview mirror once. Not for those 3 miles, and not for the rest of the drive to the interstate, and not for the 4 hours home to Louisville, which I completed in the specific, mechanical, one thing after another way that a person drives when driving is the only thing left to do. I arrived at my apartment at 6:15 in the morning. I sat in the parking lot for a while. The city was beginning to come awake. The first delivery trucks on the main street a block east. The sky turning from black to dark gray to the flat, exhausted color of urban pre-dawn. I went inside. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets for a long time. I did not sleep that day. In the weeks that followed, I looked for other accounts. Not because I expected to find solutions, but because the particular details of what I had seen. The height, the stillness, the hands, the eyes that absorbed instead of reflected. The cold that arrived and departed with surgical precision were too specific to have assembled themselves entirely from my own fear. The mind, when it generates things from exhaustion and grief, generates movement, and it generates approach. It generates threat in the form the body knows how to prepare for. It does not generate a figure standing in the center of a road with its arms at its sides, closing the distance between itself and you without any observable mechanism of movement. I found other accounts. People who drove alone at night through mountain roads in this part of the country and stopped afterward and could not fully explain what they had seen, and whose descriptions agreed on the same few things: the wrong height, the arms, the eyes, and the cold. What was consistent in every account was this: the figure did not pursue. It did not threaten. It made no gesture toward any living person. It simply appeared closer each time someone looked. I have thought about this for 11 months, turning it the way you turn a thing that has no resolution. Not because you expect to find one, but because the turning is the only available motion. What sits heaviest when I come back to it in the early hours of the morning is the fuel receipt. When I checked it later, the timestamp showed 11 minutes of transaction time at the junction station. I was inside the station for perhaps 4 minutes. I was at the pump for perhaps 3. That is 4 minutes I cannot locate. I have tried to find them. I have replayed that stop the way you replay footage, looking for the seam, looking for where time goes soft. The attendant and his small television, the old coffee and the warmth in my palms. Delmar and the wind chime, the truck on the county road. 4 minutes. I live in Louisville. I work in a building with other people, and I eat lunch in a place with windows, and most days the city is loud enough that there is no space for anything else to be loud inside it. But I do not drive Route 83 at night. I take the interstate. It adds 40 minutes each way. I have never explained this to anyone who has asked, because there is no explanation that lands as something other than what it is. And sometimes in the particular quiet between 2 and 3 in the morning, when the city pauses the way cities occasionally and inexplicably pause, I smell it, earth and copper. something older than both. I do not go to the window when it happens. I have decided, carefully, over 11 months, that this is the right choice. I think it is still out there, somewhere on a mountain road in the dark, standing still, getting closer. I worked the overnight shift at a residential care facility for 11 years, and in those 11 years, I saw a great many things that medicine explains, and a handful of things that medicine reaches for, and does not quite close its hand around. I am not a superstitious person. I am a person who was trained to observe and to record what I observe accurately and to resist the pull of interpretation until the facts are in. The facts, in this case, have been in for 17 months, and what they add up to is something I have not been able to record in any chart or report or professional document because there is no category for it, and because some things that are true do not have a home in the systems we have built for truth. This is where I am putting it instead. I want to start by telling you what memory care is actually like at 3 in the morning, because I think most people have an idea of it that is either too clean or too bleak, and the truth is more specific than either. At 3 in the morning on a locked ward, the building is as quiet as a building full of people can be, which is not very quiet. There are the machines, the oxygen concentrators, the IV pumps with their periodic tones, the HVAC system that runs continuously because the residents need a regulated temperature and cannot regulate their own. There is the call button system, which goes off unpredictably because the residents' relationship with night and day has been reorganized by their illness, and some of them are awake at 3, and some of them are awake at 3, and do not know they are awake. And some of them call for people who have not been available to come for years. There is the corridor light, which is kept at a low blue overnight, enough to navigate by, but not enough to confuse the residents who are asleep into thinking morning has come. In that light, at that hour, the corridor has a particular quality that I cannot describe as anything other than underwater. Long and still and blue and quietly, full of the sounds of people at the very far end of their lives. I did my rounds every 90 minutes, room to room, checking vitals on the flagged residents, doing visual wellness checks on the others, logging everything in the system with the precision that the job requires. I had been doing those rounds for 11 years, and I knew the corridor and the rooms and the night sounds of every resident, the way you know a place you have inhabited for a long time. In the body rather than the head, so automatic that deviations register before you have consciously identified what has deviated. That automatic recognition is what this story is about. The first deviation registered on a Tuesday night in February 17 months ago, and it registered as a sound. I was at the nurse's station, between rounds, completing documentation, and the corridor was doing what it did at that hour, which was its quiet underwater thing, the machines and the distant sound of Mrs. Kowalski in room 14 talking to someone who was not there, which she did most nights and which was within her established pattern and not a cause for response. The sound I heard was from room 8. Room 8 was Mr. Alderman, 79 years old, moderate to advanced vascular dementia, a retired civil engineer from Bowling Green, who had been in the facility for 14 months. He was not a difficult resident in the clinical sense. He was mobile and generally cooperative with care, but he had a quality of agitation that the staff had found hard to address, a low-grade persistent anxiety that presented as constant motion, as pacing, as the repeated and unanswerable question of where he was supposed to be and whether he was late. He had been an engineer who prided himself on being punctual, and the dementia had left him with the urgency of punctuality, without the ability to locate the appointment, and this combination had been causing him significant distress for the 14 months he had been in the facility, and we had been managing it with medication adjustments and routine and the various tools of good memory care, with partial success. The sound from room 8 was not the sound of Mr. Alderman pacing or calling out. It was the sound of Mr. Alderman being still. I know that sounds like nothing, like the absence of a sound rather than a sound itself. But if you have worked memory care nights, you will understand what I mean. Stillness from a person whose pattern is motion registers as a sound in the way that silence registers as a sound after a noise that has been continuous stops. It is a change in the texture of the audio environment, and it is noticeable. I went to the door of room 8, and I looked in. The night light was on, the small plug-in light by the baseboard that we kept in every room. It was enough to see by. Mr. Alderman was in his bed. He was not pacing. He was not asking where he was supposed to be. He was lying with his hands folded on the blanket, and his eyes open and his face arranged in an expression I had not seen on it in 14 months of caring for him, which was an expression of complete and uncomplicated peace. I stood in the doorway. He did not look at me. His eyes were open and directed toward the corner of the room where the window was, the east-facing window that looked out onto the locked courtyard, and his face was the face of a man watching something that he found deeply and specifically comforting. I looked at the corner. The corner was a corner. The window was dark, the courtyard beyond it unlit at this hour. The night light put a small warm circle on the floor near the baseboard. The shadows in the corner were the shadows of a room at 3 in the morning with one small light source. I did my wellness check. His vitals were fine. Better than fine, actually. His blood pressure was lower than it had been in weeks. His respiratory rate slow and even and deeply relaxed. I logged it as resting comfortably, which was accurate, and was also the most significant deviation from baseline I had recorded for him since admission. I moved on with my rounds. He was the same at the next check, and the one after. When the morning shift arrived at 6, Mr. Alderman was asleep in a way I had never observed in him. The deep, uncomplicated sleep of a person who has set something down that they had been carrying for a long time. He woke at 7:30 and ate his breakfast, and when the morning staff asked him how he was, he said, "Fine, good, very well actually," and did not ask once where he was supposed to be. That lasted for 3 days. On the 4th day, he began pacing again. began the low-grade agitation, and began the unanswerable question of where he was supposed to be and whether he was late. And I noted this, and noted the 3 days of anomalous calm, and filed both things in the part of my professional attention that is not the chart, the part that stays open and accumulates without drawing conclusions. The second deviation came the following Tuesday. Same hour, 2:50 in the morning. Room 11, Mrs. Tran was 83 years old, Alzheimer's, mid-stage, a former school teacher from Warren County, who had been in the facility for 7 months. She had a different presentation than Mr. Alderman, less agitation, more withdrawal, a quality of increasing absence, as if she were slowly leaving the building from the inside. She had grandchildren who visited every Sunday, and she recognized them less reliably each week, and this was causing the family significant distress and causing Mrs. Tran, as far as we could determine, a low-grade sadness that she could not articulate, but that was present in her face most of the time. The deviation from room 11 was the same as the one from room 8. Stillness where there was usually restlessness. And when I went to the door and looked in, Mrs. Tran was in her bed, with her hands folded and her eyes open, and her face directed toward the east-facing window, and arranged in the same expression I had seen on Mr. Alderman's face the week before. Complete and uncomplicated peace. I looked at the window. The courtyard was dark. Mrs. Tran did not look at me. Her vitals were excellent. She was deeply and evidently comfortable. She slept well that night and the following 2 nights, and on the 4th day she began her gradual withdrawal again, the low-grade sadness settling back into its place in her face. And her grandchildren came on Sunday, and she did not recognize the youngest one, and the family went home upset. I stood at the nurse's station that Sunday night after the family left, and I thought very carefully about the 2 Tuesdays, about room 8 and room 11, both east-facing, both in the hours before 3 o'clock, about the particular quality of peace on those 2 faces, which was not the peace of sedation, and not the peace of a good day, but something more specific, something I did not have a word for, the peace of a person who has received something they needed from a source they were not expecting. The following Tuesday, I did not wait at the nurse's station. I did my 10:30 rounds, and then I did my 12 o'clock rounds, and then instead of returning to the station, I positioned myself in the corridor, at the midpoint between the station and the east wing, with a clear line of sight to the doors of both room 8 and room 11, and I waited. I want to be precise about what I was doing, because I have thought about it many times in the 17 months since. I was not investigating something supernatural. I am not built for that framing. I was observing a pattern that I had recorded twice, and that did not have an explanation yet. An observation without interpretation was the tool I had, and I used it. I stood in the blue corridor light, and I listened to the building, and the building did what it did. The machines and the distant misses, Kowalski and the periodic tone of a pump in room 3 completing a cycle. At 2:47 in the morning, the corridor changed. I have been trying to put language to this for 17 months. It was not a sound, or not primarily a sound, though there was a change in the audio environment that I registered at the same time. It was a change in the quality of the corridor itself, the way a room changes when someone enters it, the subtle shift in pressure and temperature and attention that a living body brings to a space simply by being in it. Something had come into the corridor. I am going to tell you what I observed, and I am going to be accurate. I saw nothing in the corridor. That is the accurate statement. The corridor was as it had been. The blue light, the closed doors, and the station are visible at the midpoint. Nothing was present in the corridor that had not been present before, but the corridor was different. I am going to try to explain the difference, and I am going to do it in the only language I have for it, which is the language of the physical. The temperature dropped in the specific directional way that I had noticed twice in the rooms, moving from the east end of the corridor toward the station, rather than being distributed across the space. The smell changed, and the smell it changed to was not the smell of the ward, not industrial cleaner, not the underneath smell, but something else entirely. Something I could not locate in my experience. Something that was cold in the way that the smell, rather than the air, could be cold, if that distinction makes any sense. And I believe it makes sense, because it is the only accurate description I have. And the corridor was occupied, in the way that a space is occupied when a presence is in it, in the way that the body knows before the eyes confirm. I stood very still. I am going to be honest about what the body did, because the body's report is data too. The hair on my arms was present in a way it is not usually present. My mouth had gone dry. My vision had narrowed slightly at the periphery, the way it narrows when the body has made a decision about where to concentrate its resources. I was frightened. Not the performed fright of someone telling a story. The real kind, the kind that arrives in the chemistry before the narrative, that the body generates before the mind has finished forming an opinion. I stood in the corridor, and I was frightened, and I watched the door of room 8. It opened. Not dramatically, not with force. It swung slowly inward, the way a door swings when it is pushed very gently. The way a door swings when whatever is pushing it is being careful about the person on the other side. The room beyond was the dim room of the night light, and the east-facing window. I could see Mr. Alderman in his bed from the corridor. He was already in the posture, hands folded, eyes open, face directed toward the window. The expression of complete and uncomplicated peace was already in place, as if he had been expecting this. As if some part of him had known it was coming and had arranged himself accordingly. I did not go into the room. I stood in the corridor in the doorway, and I watched. The cold was in the room. I could feel it from where I stood. And the smell was in the room, and the quality of presence was in the room. And Mr. Alderman lay in his bed with his hands folded and his face at peace and his eyes on the window. And I made a decision. I stepped back. I stepped back from the doorway, and I returned to my position in the corridor. And I stood there, and I let whatever was happening in room 8 happen, and I did not intervene. And I did not document it in the chart, and I stood in the blue light of the corridor, and I breathed. I am a nurse. I am trained to intervene. Observation without intervention is not the professional mode. I am telling you that I stood in the corridor and chose not to intervene. And I am telling you why, and the why is not clinical and is not defensible in any professional framework. And I am going to tell you anyway, because he looked more peaceful than I had ever seen him in 14 months of caring for him. Because whatever was in that room with him was giving him something that I had not been able to give him, that the facility had not been able to give him, that the medication adjustments and the routine and the tools of good memory care had not been able to give him. Because the expression on his face was not the expression of a person in distress. It was the expression of a person who has been found. I stood in the corridor for 20 minutes. At some point during those 20 minutes, the cold thinned and the smell thinned, and the quality of presence in the corridor and in room we ate dissipated with the gradual directional recession I had come to recognize, moving back toward the east end of the building and then gone. Mr. Alderman's door, which had been open, was not open anymore. It was closed. I went to the door and listened. From inside the room came the sound of his breathing, slow and deep and utterly at rest. I went back to the station. I sat down. I looked at the chart and I wrote, resting comfortably, and I stared at the 2 words for a while. Then I wrote, no acute distress noted, vital signs stable, and I closed the chart. Over the following weeks, I observed the same pattern 7 more times. Always Tuesday, always between 2:45 and 3:15. Always the east wing rooms, always the rooms with the east-facing windows, always the residents who were carrying the most distress at any given time, as if it knew, as if it had made assessments that paralleled my own assessments and arrived at the same conclusions about who needed it most. I watched it happen in room 11 and in room 14, Mrs. Kowalski, who stopped asking for the husband who had been dead for 9 years in the hours after, and slept for the first time in weeks without calling out, and in room 7 and in room 3. Each time, the resident was calmer in the days following. Each time the calm degraded over 3 or 4 days, and the distress returned. Each time the following Tuesday, it came back. I told no one. I have thought about whether that was the right choice for 17 months, and I have not resolved it, and I believe I am not going to resolve it. And I have made a kind of peace with that, which is its own strange thing. Here is what I told myself, and what I still tell myself, and what I still partly believe. Whatever was coming into the East Wing on Tuesday nights was not harming the residents. The evidence for this was 17 weeks of observation and the vital signs that accompanied every visit, which were consistently and measurably better during and after than before. Whatever it was not a predator. It was not taking anything from these people that they had not already lost. What it seemed to be doing, and I am using seem deliberately, because I am a person trained to observe and resist interpretation, and I am resisting it even now, was sitting with them, keeping them company in the hours when the night is longest and the confusion is worst, and the people they most want beside them are not available to be beside them. That is what it looked like. That is what the faces looked like every Tuesday in the blue light of the East Wing at 3 in the morning. People who had been found. I left the facility 12 months ago. The reasons were professional and personal and unrelated to the Tuesday nights. Or mostly unrelated. Or at least I tell myself mostly, which may or may not be accurate. Before I left, I went through the logs for 17 months, and I looked at the patterns the way a researcher looks at patterns, with the question of what the data says rather than what I want it to say. The residents who received the Tuesday visits lived on average longer than the actuarial models for their diagnoses predicted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would flag in a study, but consistently, and across every resident in the East Wing, longer and with measurably less distress in the final weeks than the comparable residents in the West Wing who did not have east-facing windows and whom, as far as I could determine from 17 months of observation, the Tuesday presence did not visit. I do not know what to do with that. I do not know what to do with any of it, which is why I am putting it here, in the only place I have found for it, which is words in a form that someone else might hear. There is one more thing, and it is the thing I have held longest, and told no one. On the last Tuesday before I left the facility, I did not stand in the corridor. I stood in my own office, which was in the East Wing, which had a window that faced the courtyard. At 2:47, I felt the corridor change, the way I had learned to feel it change. The cold and the smell and the quality of presence arriving. I stood at my office window, and I looked out at the courtyard. The courtyard is small, 40 feet by 60 feet, with a walking path and 2 benches and a container garden the occupational therapy team maintains from April through October. At 3 in the morning in late March, it was empty and dark, and the path was wet from the rain earlier in the evening. Something was standing in the courtyard, at the edge of the path, near the far bench, standing with its arms at its sides. It was tall. In the dark and at that distance, I could not resolve detail beyond the shape of it, which was vertical and still and occupying space, in the way that a solid thing occupies space. Not a trick of the light or a shape made by the eye in darkness. It was standing in the courtyard of a locked memory care facility at 2:47 in the morning. It was still. And then it turned, not toward me, not tracking my movement at the window. It turned the way something turns when it has finished what it came to do and is orienting toward what comes next. A slow and purposeful turning that was the turning of a thing that knows where it is going. It faced the East Wing. It faced the building. It faced the rooms where people were lying in their beds with their hands folded and their faces at peace. And then it was gone. Not walking away, not retreating. Gone in the way that things are gone when the eye finds something else to do and returns to the space where the thing was and finds the space simply empty, as if the presence and the absence were the same thing viewed from slightly different angles. I stood at the window for a long time. I thought about the residents, about Mr. Alderman and Mrs. Tran and Mrs. Kowalski and the 7 others, about the faces at peace in the East Wing rooms and the 3 days of calm that followed each Tuesday, and the vital signs that were consistently better, and the actuarial predictions that the East Wing residents consistently outlived. I thought about what my grandmother would have said. If I had had a grandmother given to saying things about presences in courtyards at 3 in the morning, which I did not, but the thought arrived anyway, and brought with it the warmth that thoughts of people who loved you bring, even when those people are gone. I thought about whether the thing in the courtyard was frightening. It was frightening. I am not going to tell you it was not, because honesty is the only currency this account has, and I am not going to spend it on a comfortable conclusion. It was frightening, and the people it was visiting were calmer for the visiting. And I do not know what to do with both of those things being true simultaneously, which is the position I have occupied for 17 months, and which I am beginning to think may simply be the position, the place, where this particular truth lives. In the space between frightening and kind, where there is no word and no chart field and no professional category, and nothing to do but stand in it and breathe. Some of the residents I cared for in those 17 months have since died. Mr. Alderman died in August, 8 months after I left. His daughter sent me a note because she knew I had cared for him. She said his last weeks were quieter than they had been, that he had stopped asking where he was supposed to be, that in the final days he had seemed to know something the rest of them did not. She said it was a comfort. I read that note 3 times. I thought about Tuesday nights, and the east-facing window, and the courtyard. I thought about what it might mean that he had stopped asking where he was supposed to be. And I thought about the possibility, which I have been thinking about for 17 months, and which I cannot confirm and cannot dismiss, that in the end someone showed him. There is a moment, right before you understand what you are looking at, where the brain does something strange. It goes quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. Not the kind that comes with peace or sleep or the end of a long day. The kind that comes when every system in you has stopped what it was doing and redirected itself toward one single question. And the question has no answer yet, and the quiet is the sound of waiting for one. I have lived in that quiet for 14 months now, and I am not sure I have ever fully come back out of it. I want to start by telling you something true about the farmhouse on Cutler Ridge Road, something that has nothing at all to do with what happened there in November, and everything to do with why it mattered so much when it did. My Uncle Gerald built that house in 1981 with money he saved over 7 years working double shifts at the glass factory in Lancaster, and he built it the way men of that generation and that county built things, slowly, correctly, with the intention that it would outlast him, and probably his children, and possibly their children after that. He poured the foundation himself, with 2 cousins helping. He framed it over 2 summers. The floors are white oak, and they are level, and in 32 years the doors never stopped closing flush, the way doors in cheaper houses stopped closing flush after the first winter. Gerald never married. He had a dog for most of those years, a series of them actually, all named Pete for reasons he never explained. And he had the house and the 11 acres around it and a vegetable garden, and that took up a full quarter of the south field, and that was what he wanted, and he was not apologetic about it. He died in September of a heart thing that moved fast, the way heart things sometimes do in men who were never sick a day in their lives, and so never built up any practice at it. He was 67 years old. He did not suffer long. That is the thing my father kept saying in the days after. He did not suffer long, as if the speed of it was a mercy. And I understood what my father meant, and I also understood that fast is not the same as painless for the people left behind it. I went to Perry County in the second week of November to close up the house for the winter, which meant draining the pipes and pulling the storm windows down from the attic and checking the gutters before the first freeze. And which also meant, though no one said it directly, being the one who went through the rooms and decided what needed to stay and what needed to go, and what the house needed to be now that it was a house without a person in it. I volunteered for this because I am the kind of person who volunteers for the things no one else wants to do. Not out of nobility, but because the waiting is worse than the doing for me. Sitting at home and knowing the house was up there on Cutler Ridge, empty and going cold, would have been harder than going. I drove up on a Friday after work, arrived around 9 in the evening, and the house was dark from the road, and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before I went in. Not because I was frightened, just because I was not quite ready, and because I needed to understand that the house was a house now and not a presence, which is a distinction that takes a moment when you have known a place through the person who lived in it for your entire life. The key was under the third step, which is where Gerald always kept it, and where everyone in the family knew it was, and where, as Gerald used to say, any burglar who had done 30 seconds of research would also know it was. And so the security was not really about the hiding and more about the shared knowledge of the family, which was its own kind of lock. Inside, the house smelled like Gerald. I know that sounds simple, but it is the thing that got me first. The thing that hit before I had even found the light switch. That particular combination of wood smoke and machine oil and the specific soap he had used for as long as I could remember. A plain yellow bar soap that I do not think is manufactured anymore, and that he bought in bulk from somewhere 40 bars at a time, and that I had last smelled in August when I visited, and sat with him on the back porch, and we talked about the garden and his plans for the spring. He did not make it to spring. I stood in the entryway for a moment, with the smell of him all around me, and the house dark, and the sound of the wind working at the northwest corner of the roof, the way it had always worked at that corner. And I did my best, and then I found the light switch and turned it on, and the house became a house again, and I got to work. I spent Friday evening and most of Saturday going through the practical things. The pipes, the windows, the gutters, a section of soffit on the east side, that had come loose and needed a temporary fix before the snow. The physical work was good. The physical work gave the grief a place to go, channeled it into something with steps and outcomes and visible results. And by Saturday evening, I had covered most of what needed covering. And I was tired in the way that I like to be tired, which is physically and usefully, and without much room left for the other kind. I ate something I found in the pantry. I sat in Gerald's chair in the front room, the brown one with the reading lamp beside it, and I watched the light outside go from gray to dark, and I thought about him. Not with sadness exactly, or not only with sadness, with the particular weight of someone who was real and specific and is now gone, which is a different feeling than sadness, heavier in some places and lighter in others, and without a clean name that I have ever found. There was a cat. I should tell you about the cat, because the cat is how the first wrong thing announced itself. Gerald did not have a cat. Gerald had dogs. The Peets, one after another, the latest one, rehomed with Gerald's neighbor Carl after the death, because Carl had a big yard and the dog already knew him. Gerald had never, in my memory, owned or expressed any interest in owning a cat. So when I heard the sound from the kitchen at approximately 10:30 on Saturday night, a small sound, a particular sound, the sound a cat makes when it is moving along a baseboard and its tail catches the wall, I went to the kitchen to see what was there. Nothing was there. The kitchen was empty and orderly, and exactly as I had left it when I washed my dishes after dinner. The back door was closed. The window above the sink was latched. I stood in the kitchen for a moment and listened, and the house was quiet, and I went back to the front room and sat down. I had been in Gerald's chair for maybe 3 minutes when the smell arrived. It came from no particular direction. That is the thing that is hard to explain about it. It did not come from the kitchen, from the hall, or from beneath the back door where outside air sometimes got in. It was simply present in the room in a way that it had not been present 30 seconds before. The way a smell is present when its source is already inside the space, rather than entering it. It was cold in the smell, not the smell of cold air. The cold was in the smell itself, underneath it, the way iron is in the taste of well water. Not the dominant thing, but structural, present in everything, there even when you are not thinking about it. It was also familiar in a way I could not immediately place. Not Gerald's smell, not the wood smoke and soap I had walked into the night before. Something older than that. Something that did not belong to any person I could name. I turned the reading lamp up to its highest setting. I sat in Gerald's chair, and I looked at the room, and the room looked back at me, the way a room does when it is a room and nothing more. The furniture and the walls and the rag rug that Gerald's mother had made in the 1950s, and that had been in this house since the day it was built. And then I noticed the shadow in the far corner of the room was wrong. Not dramatically, not in a way that would read as alarming in a photograph. A corner of any room in any old house has shadow in it at night, even with the lamp on, especially with a single lamp in the center of the space, throwing light in one direction. and leaving everything behind it in the relative dark. But the shadow in the far left corner of Gerald's front room was slightly the wrong shape. I mean that precisely. Not wrong the way darkness is wrong when you are already frightened and looking for things to be afraid of. Wrong in the structural sense. The geometry of it did not match the geometry of the corner, which I had looked at for 14 years of visits, and knew the way you know a familiar room, the way it sits in the back of your mind as a settled fact. The shape in that corner was taller than the corner, not by much, by perhaps a foot. By the amount that a person who was standing in a corner and pressed back into it would extend above the ceiling line of the shadow if they were slightly taller than the room expected. I looked at it directly. It did not move. The thing about something that does not move is that not moving is a choice, or it presents itself as a choice. And a thing that is choosing not to move is different from a thing that is simply still the way furniture is still. I stood up from Gerald's chair. My legs did this before I had made a clear decision to stand, which I note because I want to be accurate about what the body does in these moments. The legs made the decision, and the rest of me followed, and I was standing in the center of the rag rug, with the reading lamp behind me and the wrong shadow in the corner ahead of me, and for a moment I did not do anything at all. My mouth was dry. Not the kind of dry that a drink of water addresses, but the kind that is a physical report from the body. The body telling you that it has redirected certain resources, and saliva production is not among the priorities right now. I said something out loud. I do not know exactly what, some fragment of sentence, some ordinary thing. A word or two directed at the corner the way you say something out loud in an empty house at night, not because you expect an answer, but because a voice in the air changes the quality of the air. And changing the quality of the air was what I needed. The shadow did not respond. The shadow did not change. I walked to the corner. There was nothing there. The corner was a corner. Plaster walls, the edge of the baseboard, a small water stain near the floor that had been there since a leak in 2007 that Gerald had fixed himself. I put my hand on the wall. The wall was the temperature of a wall in a heated house in November. I stood in the corner and turned around and looked at the room from that position, from the position that the wrong shadow had occupied. And the room was a room, and the reading lamp was doing exactly what a reading lamp does. I went to bed. I am telling you this without drama because that is how it happened. I went to bed. Not because I had fully convinced myself that the shadow was nothing, but because the alternative to going to bed was staying awake in the chair in a house that had just done something I could not explain, and bed seemed, on balance, like the better option. The bedroom I used when I visited was the one at the end of the hall. The one Gerald called the guest room because it faced east, and the morning light came in strong and early. I had slept in it dozens of times. I knew the way the bed frame creaked when you turned over and the way the closet door drifted open slightly in the night, if you did not pull it quite hard enough, and the way the house settled around. 2 in the morning in a pattern of 3 sounds. A tick from the east wall, a lower sound from the floor of the hall, a final one from somewhere in the structure of the roof that I had cataloged over years without thinking about it. I laid down. I left the hall light on, which I had not done on the previous night, and which I told myself was because I might need to navigate the hall in the dark, and the house was unfamiliar enough without Gerald in it, that the hall light was a practical precaution. And some part of me accepted this explanation, and some part of me knew exactly what the hall light was for. I was almost asleep, that particular half-state, where the thoughts have started to lose their edges, and the body has begun its process of letting go. When the cold came into the room, I want to describe this carefully, because it is the thing I have the most difficulty making accurate. It was not the cold of a draft, which has a direction, which comes from somewhere and goes somewhere. It was not the cold of a window that had been left open, which has a source point, a place in the room from which the temperature is lowest and from which it radiates outward. It was a cold that arrived everywhere in the room at the same time, as if the room had changed its relationship to warmth all at once, as if warmth had become suddenly optional, suddenly something the room had been providing out of courtesy rather than necessity, and had quietly decided to stop. I was awake immediately. I was awake in the complete, total way that you are awake when something has pulled you back from the edge of sleep before you had crossed it, without any of the fogginess or the where am I of ordinary waking. Completely awake, both eyes open, every system present and reporting. The room was dark because I had turned the bedside lamp off before I lay down, and the hall light made a thin line under the door, and that was all. The closet was open. I could see the absence of the door in the dark. To my left, the slightly darker rectangle of the closet interior. I lay still. I want to be honest about the specific quality of what I did in that moment, which was, I made a decision to be still. Not because I was paralyzed or because the body had taken over in the way that happens in the worst moments. Because some deliberate part of me, some part that was working calmly underneath the fear, understood that being still was the right choice, and that moving was a different choice, with different consequences, and that for the moment I did not want to make the different choice. I lay still and I breathed and I listened. The house was very quiet, and then, slowly over the course of what I estimate was about 30 seconds, I became aware that the closet was less dark than it had been, not lighter, less dark. The distinction matters. It was not that light had entered the closet from somewhere. It was that the closet contained something that was interrupting the dark from inside it, taking up space in the dark, the way a solid object takes up space. Visible not because it was illuminated, but because it was there, present in the dark, in a way that dark alone is not present. It was tall. Inside the closet, which was a standard closet in a 1981 farmhouse, it was tall enough that I could not see, from where I lay, where its top edge was. It was not moving. I lay in the bed and I looked at it, and it stood in the closet, And in 14 months, I have never found a better word for the specific experience of that than this. It was patient. Whatever it was, patience was its primary quality. Not threat, not hunger, not any of the things you would expect if you were constructing a frightening thing from scratch. Pure patience, the quality of something that has nowhere else to be and is not inconvenienced by the time this is taking. My hands were gripping the blanket. I noticed this in the distant, informational way that you notice physical facts in moments like that one. My hands were gripping the blanket, and my mouth was dry, and my vision had narrowed slightly at the edges, pulling in the way vision pulls in when the body has decided to concentrate all of its resources on one point. I thought, in the way that the mind reaches for the mundane when it is standing at the edge of something it cannot process. I thought about the storm windows I had not yet put up on the north side of the house. I thought about the specific way Gerald used to bring them down from the attic, one at a time, carrying them at an angle through the attic hatch. I thought about his hands on the wood frames of those windows. I thought about his hands in general, which had been a carpenter's hands and a gardener's hands and the hands of someone who fixed things rather than replacing them, and I thought about how those hands were not here anymore and would not be bringing down storm windows in the spring or in any spring after this one. The mind uses love as a wall when it has run out of other walls. The thing in the closet did not move while I was thinking about Gerald's hands. It stood in the same place with the same patience, taking up the same space in the dark. And then, without drama, without announcement, the cold thinned. Over the course of perhaps 2 minutes, the temperature in the room returned to what it had been, not all at once. Gradually, from the edges of the room inward, the way warmth returns when a door that has been left open is finally closed. And as the cold thinned, the thing in the closet became less present in the dark, less solid, less there. Until it was not there. Until the closet was a closet again, with Gerald's extra blankets on the shelf, and his winter coat hanging from the rod and the darkness inside it, the ordinary darkness of a small enclosed space at 3 in the morning. I did not sleep again that night. I lay in the bed until the east window began to lighten, and then I got up and made coffee in Gerald's kitchen. And I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the back field and the tree line and the gray November sky, and I tried to find the correct way to understand what had happened. I could not find it. What I did instead was go back to work. I put up the remaining storm windows. I fixed the soffit properly, rather than the temporary fix I had done the day before. I went through the remainder of the rooms with the methodical attention that the work required, and I did not go back to the front room corner, or stand in the guest room closet, or think too directly about the cold, or the patience, or the shape in the dark. I drove home Sunday evening on the county road, and then the state route, and then the interstate, and I did not stop. In the weeks that followed, I spoke to 2 people about it, not because I expected answers, because the carrying of it alone has a weight that eventually requires redistribution. The first was my father, Gerald's brother, who is not a man given to talk about things that cannot be touched and measured. He listened without interrupting, which is itself unusual for him, and at the end he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that Gerald had mentioned something to him once, years ago, not in a serious way, not in the way of someone making a claim, but in passing, the way you mention a thing you are not sure you believe but that you want to have said out loud at least once. Gerald had told my father that occasionally in the years he lived on Cutler Ridge, he would wake in the night with the sense that something was in the house. Not threatening, not malicious. Patient was the word Gerald had used. Like something just waiting to see what you are going to do, Gerald had said. And then he had laughed, and my father had laughed, and neither of them had brought it up again until I brought it up now. Patient, the same word. The second person I spoke to was a woman named Ruth, who is 73 years old and has lived 3 miles from Gerald's property her entire life, who knew Gerald well and who brought a casserole to the family gathering after the funeral, and who sat with my mother for an hour and held her hand. I called her because I did not know who else in that community to call, and because she had the quality that some older people in small rural communities have, of knowing the history of a place not as a list of facts, but as a living thing, something you carry in the body rather than the head. I told her what I had experienced. She listened the way my father had listened, without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Did it seem interested in you, or did it seem like it was simply there?" I thought about that for a moment. "Simply there," I said. She made a sound that was not quite agreement, but close to it, and then she said, "People on this ridge have known about that for a long time. It is not something that does anything. It is something that has been here longer than the houses, and that moves through them the way weather moves through. And most people who encounter it once, and then it does not come back." And she said she thought that was probably true in my case as well. I asked her what it was. She said she did not know. She said she was not sure knowing was available. I have thought about that for 14 months. About whether knowing is available. About whether the absence of knowing is its own kind of answer. Whether some things exist specifically in the space where explanations run out, not because they are beyond explanation, but because explanation is not the tool they respond to. I do not live on Cutler Ridge. I live in Columbus, in an apartment on the 4th floor, with the city noise coming through the window, and most of the time the city is loud enough that there is no room for anything else to be present. But November is here again, and some evenings, in the early dark of it, when the temperature drops and the apartment goes quiet in that specific way, that apartments in old buildings go quiet, as if the walls are listening. I smell it, the cold underneath everything else, and I do not look at the corners. I have decided that is still the right choice. Gerald lived in that house for 32 years and slept in it every night and tended his garden and fixed his own roof and named all his dogs Pete, and was, by every account of everyone who knew him, a man who was at peace with the life he had made. I think about that, I think he must have known and chosen to stay anyway, and that tells me something about him that I am still, 14 months later, trying to be worthy of. The house is still there on Cutler Ridge. I have not gone back, but I think when the spring comes I might.